She was 24 years old in the autumn of 1887, standing at the edge of a Dakota Territory road with $11.40 sewn into the hem of her petticoat, a valise that held 2 dresses and her late father's brass surveying compass, and nowhere in the wide, wind-combed world to call home. Temperance Rourke had been cast out 3 days before by Otis Rourke, her father-in-law, a hard and grieving man who blamed her, wrongly, cruelly, but with the kind of conviction that no gentle word could soften, for the death of his son, her husband Daniel, who had been thrown from a horse on a July morning and never woke again. Otis had given her until sundown to leave the Rourke homestead, and she had gone without argument, because arguing with grief is like arguing with weather. With what little money remained to her name, she did something that the town of Coldwater Crossing would call foolish for years afterward. She paid $3 at a tax auction for a worthless, weed-choked 40 acres up in a place called Millrace Hollow, land that every county map for 30 years had marked with a small black square and the word mill. Though not a soul living could recall a mill ever standing there, and the county clerk himself called it a surveyor's old joke, a mistake copied faithfully from map to map like a stone skipped so many times across water that no one remembered the hand that first threw it. But what Temperance did not know, could not have known, when she signed her name to that deed with a trembling hand, was that something had been sealed inside that hollow for over 20 years, something that still turned, still breathed, still fed people in the dark, and that her $3 would not only save her life, but restore a forgotten corner of the world to the light. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Temperance Rourke. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments, because this is a story about how nothing is ever as worthless as the world decides to believe. Temperance had not always been a woman with nothing. She had been raised the only daughter of Malachi Rourke, no relation to Otis, a coincidence of surnames she would only later find strange and then, stranger still, meaningful, a land surveyor who had walked half of the Dakota and Minnesota territories with a chain and a transit and a leather ledger he guarded like scripture. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and so it had been Malachi who raised her, dragging her along on surveys from the time she could walk, teaching her to read a plat map before she could properly read a primer. He used to say that a map was not a picture of the land but a promise about it, and that a surveyor's whole duty was to make sure the promise was kept, that a line drawn in ink 1,000 miles from where it mattered would still be honest when a farmer's grandson came looking for his fence. He taught her to sight a benchmark, to true a compass against the pull of iron in the ground, to read the small notations in the margins of old surveys that most men skipped over, the initials, the dates, the strange little symbols that surveyors sometimes left for each other like a private language, a kind of trade guild shorthand that meant something only to those who had learned it. A map. He told her once, when she was no older than 9, sitting on his knee with a plat of the Missouri bottomland spread across his lap. Is a story written by someone who wanted the next person to know the truth, even if the truth was inconvenient. She did not understand, then, how deeply those words would come to matter. She learned other things too, in that itinerant childhood, how to keep a ledger balance to the penny, because her father distrusted banks and kept his own accounts with an obsessive, beautiful precision, how to dress a wound, bake a hard sourdough starter into something that could feed a crew of 6 on a bad week, and mend harness leather with a bone needle. She learned patience, most of all, because surveying was a patient man's trade, full of long silences and longer waiting, of measuring twice and speaking once. When Malachi Rourke died of a fever in the winter she was 19, she was left with his compass, his ledger, and precious little else, and she had married Daniel Rourke the following spring not out of romance so much as necessity and genuine fondness. He was a gentle, uncomplicated man who liked her cooking and her quiet company and never once made her feel foolish for correcting his arithmetic. She had gone to live on the Rourke homestead outside Coldwater Crossing, a modest cattle and wheat operation that Otis ran with an iron hand and a harder heart, and for 5 years she had kept their books, doctored their stock, and quietly, without complaint, absorbed the 1,000 small cruelties of a father-in-law who had never wanted her there and made sure she knew it. She told herself it did not matter, because she had Daniel, and Daniel was kind, and kindness, she believed, was the rarest crop a person could grow in that country and worth tending above all others. Then came the July morning that took him from her. Daniel's horse spooked at a rattlesnake in the coulee behind the north pasture, and he was thrown, and struck his head against a stone the size of a loaf of bread, and by the time anyone found him the light had already gone out of his eyes. Otis Rourke did not weep, not where anyone could see him. He simply hardened, the way wet clay hardens in a kiln, and within days he had convinced himself, against all reason, against the plain fact that Temperance had been 40 miles away tending a sick aunt when the accident happened, that she had somehow brought misfortune down on his son, that she was a woman marked by loss, first her mother, then her father, now her husband, and that loss followed her the way flies follow a wound. Grief makes poor logic into iron conviction, and Otis Rourke had never been a man inclined to question his own convictions once they hardened. He gave her 3 days to gather what was rightfully hers, which he interpreted as narrowly as the law would allow, and on the 4th day he stood on the porch and watched her walk down the lane with her valise and did not say goodbye. She walked the 11 miles into Coldwater Crossing with her father's compass in her pocket and her mind turning over what little she had left, and it was there, outside the county courthouse, that she saw the notice for the autumn tax auction, parcels forfeited for unpaid taxes, to be sold to the highest bidder, cash only, no warranties given or implied. Most of the parcels were nothing, gullied hillsides and alkali flats that no sane farmer would touch, and the auctioneer moved through them briskly, barely pausing for bids. But when he came to a 40-acre parcel up in a fold of the hills called Millrace Hollow, there was a ripple of laughter among the dozen men gathered there, and someone called out, "Sell it to a fool, then, and be done with it." And the auctioneer laughed along and said the county would be glad to be rid of it, since it had sat on the tax rolls unclaimed and unwanted for as long as anyone could remember. Temperance asked the man beside her, an old freighter with tobacco-stained whiskers, why the land was such a joke, and he told her that every map of the county for 30 years had marked that hollow with a mill that had never been built, that some surveyor, long dead now, had drawn a black square there and the word mill, and no one had ever found a sense in it, because there was no mill, there had never been a mill, and the land itself was too steep and too far from any road to be worth the labor of clearing it. Man draws a lie on a map, the freighter said, spitting into the dust. And 40 years later folks still believe it's the truth. But Temperance, standing there with her father's voice still fresh in her memory, a map is a promise, and a surveyor's whole duty is to make sure the promise is kept, felt something in her chest that she could not entirely name. It might have been foolishness, as everyone in that courtyard clearly believed. It might have been desperation, since $3 was cheap enough that she could afford it and still have $8.40 to her name, and land, however poor, was a roof of sorts, or at least the promise of one. But some small, stubborn part of her wondered why a mistake would be so carefully repeated, map after map, for 30 straight years, when surveyors were not, in her experience, careless men, and a genuine error was far more likely to be quietly corrected than faithfully copied for 3 decades running. She raised her hand when the bidding opened, and no one raised against her, and for $3, less than the price of a decent hat, Temperance Rourke became the owner of 40 acres of supposedly worthless hillside, a phantom mill, and a joke the whole town would tell for months. She rode out to see her purchase 2 days later, on a mule she traded some mending work for, following a track that grew fainter and fainter until it was little more than a deer path threading up through birch and spruce, the hollow narrowing around her like the throat of a bottle. The air changed as she climbed, cooler, damper, carrying a mineral sweetness she associated with running water, though the country round about was dry enough that August. She heard it before she saw it, not the roar of a river, but a low, steady, rhythmic sound, a kind of patient wooden knocking, so regular and so mechanical that for a moment her mind refused to accept what her ears were telling her, because that sound belonged to a working mill, and there was no mill in Millrace Hollow. There had never been a mill in Millrace Hollow, the whole town had told her so with great confidence not 3 days before. She came around a stand of cottonwoods and stopped her mule dead in the trail, and there below her, tucked into a fold of the hillside so cunningly that it could not be seen from more than 50 yards in any direction, stood a gristmill, weathered gray shingle, a great wooden wool turning steady and patient in a diverted spring-fed race, smoke curling faint and gray from a stone chimney, a mill that every map for 30 years had insisted did not exist, running as though it had never stopped. She sat on that mule for a long while, her heart hammering, watching the wheel turn and trying to make her mind accept the plain evidence of her eyes, and it was in that stillness that an old man stepped out from the mill's low doorway, wiping flour-dusted hands on his apron, and looked up at her with an expression that was not quite alarm and not quite welcome, but something wearier and more complicated than either, the look, she would come to understand, of a man who had spent half his life hoping no stranger would ever find that trail, and the other half fearing the day one finally did. His name was Ezra Coe, and he was 71 years old, and what Temperance learned that afternoon, sitting on an overturned flour barrel while he ground a sack of buckwheat and eyed her with cautious, measuring patience, would unravel over the following days into one of the most carefully guarded secrets in the whole of that territory. Ezra had been born enslaved in Kentucky and had come west after the war with a small company of freed people, some 24 souls, families mostly, folk who had heard that land could be had in the territories and who wanted, more than anything on this earth, a place where no one could tell them to move on. They had settled first on open ground near Coldwater Crossing, but had been driven off twice by night riders who did not want a free black settlement anywhere near their town, their fences burned and one man beaten half to death, and so the little company had retreated up into the hills, into a hollow so narrow and so hidden that a person could walk within 100 yards of it and never suspect a soul lived there. They had found a spring-fed creek with good fall to it, and among their number had been a millwright. Ezra's own father, who had built, quietly, at night, over the course of 2 winters, with lumber hauled in a few boards at a time so as never to raise a wagon track that anyone could follow, the gristmill that now stood before her. They had never registered it, never announced it, never let it appear on any tax roll or county record, because the moment the world knew there was a working mill up in that hollow, the world would come looking for who ran it, and who ran it were people the world of 1887 Dakota Territory was not, in Ezra's father's carefully considered judgment, prepared to leave in peace. And yet the mill needed to exist on paper somewhere, needed some legal shadow of itself, because Ezra's father had been a cautious man who understood that land unclaimed by anyone was land any powerful man might one day simply take, and so he had done something clever and strange. He had befriended, in secret, a county surveyor named Josiah Vance who had once, years before in Kentucky, been helped across a river by a company of freed people fleeing the same war that had freed them, and who owed a debt he had never forgotten. Vance had agreed, at great personal risk to his professional standing, to mark the hollow on the official county maps with a small black square and the word mill, not to reveal the settlement, but to establish, in the dry legal language that governments respect above all other kinds of truth, that the parcel was improved land, occupied land, land with a structure upon it, so that should anyone ever try to claim it as vacant or unclaimed, the maps themselves would stand as quiet witness against them. He had never built it, officially. He had simply drawn what already existed and dared no one to look closely enough to ask why. And then, understanding that a map alone could not protect them forever, Vance had done one thing more, the thing that Ezra's father had considered the truest safeguard of all. He had filed the parcel, year after year, under a small, deliberately unremarkable tax assessment, cheap enough that it would draw no attention, precisely so that if the settlement's fortunes ever failed and the taxes went unpaid, the land would default to auction rather than to seizure by any single grasping party, because an auction, unlike a seizure, was public, was recorded, was a matter any citizen could bid upon, including, though Vance could hardly have imagined it so specifically, a young widow with $3 and a father who had taught her to read the true meaning hidden in an old map's margins. Ezra's father was long dead now, and so was Josiah Vance, and the settlement itself had dwindled over the decades, some families moving on to claim land of their own further west once the country grew a little safer, some passing away, some simply growing old, until what remained in the hollow, when Temperance found it, was Ezra himself, his granddaughter Willa, a sharp and watchful young woman of 19 who had never known any other home, and 4 other elderly souls who had nowhere else in the world to go and no wish, at their age, to find out whether the world beyond the hollow had grown any kinder. The mill still ran because it still had to. Ezra ground grain not for money, since he had none to charge and no market he dared enter, but in a quiet trade that had grown up over the years with a handful of trusted homesteaders scattered through the outer hills, Norwegian and German immigrant families mostly, poor themselves and asking no questions, who brought their wheat up the hollow trail after dark and left with flour, and left in turn what they could spare, salt, coffee, cloth, a little cash when they had it, medicine when someone was sick. It was a fragile, threadbare economy, built entirely on trust and silence, and it had sustained 6 people for 20 years, but Ezra was 71 and his hands shook more than they used to, and he told Temperance, with a frankness that surprised her, that he had begun to wonder, these last years, what would become of the mill and the hollow and the 4 old souls depending on it once he was no longer able to lift a grain sack. Temperance rode back down out of the hollow that evening with her mind entirely transformed. She had gone up that trail owning, as far as the world knew, $3 worth of worthless hillside, and she came down knowing that she was, in fact, the legal owner, the deeded, tax-auction purchased, entirely lawful owner, of a working mill that had fed a hidden community for 2 decades, and that the secret of its existence now rested as much in her keeping as in Ezra Coe's. She could have done many things with that knowledge. She could have sold the deed, once its true value was known, to any of the timber or milling concerns that would have paid handsomely for good water power and standing works. She could have simply taken possession, in the plain letter of the law, and told Ezra and Willa and the others that they were welcome to stay only on her terms. She thought of none of these things, not for one moment, because she remembered too clearly what it was to be told by someone with power over her that she did not belong somewhere, and she had no wish to become, for anyone else, an Otis Rourke. What she did instead, over the weeks that followed, was move up into the hollow herself, into a small loft above the mill's grain store that Willa helped her fashion into a livable room, and she began doing what her father had raised her to do. She began setting the mill's affairs to rights on paper, the way it should have been done from the beginning if the world had ever been fair enough to allow it. She used her father's ledger-keeping to draw up an honest accounting of the milling trade, so that what had been an improvised barter economy could become something sturdier. She used her knowledge of surveying and deeds to understand exactly what her $3 purchase entitled her to, and, more importantly, what it protected. And she began to understand, turning the problem over the way her father had taught her to turn over a difficult sight line, that the very secrecy which had protected the mill for 20 years had also become its greatest danger, because a mill that existed nowhere in the public record could be erased from the world as easily and as silently as it had once been hidden from it, the moment anyone with sufficient power decided it should be. That danger arrived, as such dangers do, in the shape of a man who had never once climbed the hollow trail but who had, that same autumn, set his sights firmly upon it. Cornelius Vane, no relation, despite the coincidence of names, to the long-dead surveyor Josiah Vance, though Temperance herself would spend an uneasy night wondering about it before satisfying herself it was mere chance, was the principal banker of Coldwater Crossing and a man of considerable ambition, who had learned, through channels never entirely clear to Temperance, that a railroad spur was being surveyed to run through the county within 2 years, and that whoever controlled the water rights and the elevation advantage of Millrace Hollow stood to make a fortune supplying the spur's construction crews and, later, the mills and grain depots that would spring up along its route. Vane had tried for years, quietly, to acquire the Hollow's tax parcel himself, always outbid at the last moment by unseen forces he did not understand, Vance's old safeguard working exactly as intended, and when he learned, through courthouse gossip, that some widow woman had bought it out from under him for $3 at the very auction he'd meant to attend himself before a business matter delayed him, his frustration curdled quickly into something harder and more determined. He came to call on her that October, riding up the hollow trail himself for the first time, dressed in a fine gray coat entirely wrong for the terrain, and he found her standing at the mill door with flour on her hands and Ezra Coe working the hopper behind her, and something in his face, a flicker of calculation, quickly masked, told Temperance that he had understood, in that single glance, both the mill's true value and the vulnerability of the people who kept it. He was courteous, even complimentary, offering to purchase the parcel from her for a sum that would have seemed, to a woman with $3 a month before, an almost unimaginable fortune, and when she declined, gently but without hesitation, his courtesy thinned, and he let slip, as men like Cornelius Vane so often do when their first offer fails, the shape of the threat beneath it, that a woman alone, with no husband, no standing in the county, and He let this hang delicately in the air. Certain persons residing on her land whose presence there had never been legally documented, might find that her claim to the parcel was more fragile than she supposed, should anyone care to challenge it before a judge. He rode back down the trail that afternoon, and within a fortnight the challenge came, filed at the county courthouse, a claim that the original tax parcel had been fraudulently and improperly assessed for decades, true enough, in its way, though not for the reasons Vane alleged, and that the sale to Temperance Rourke should therefore be voided and the land returned to open auction, where a man like Cornelius Vane, with far deeper pockets than any grieving widow, could be certain of the outcome. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Temperance's life since the week she buried Daniel. Vane's challenge threw the whole hollow into a state of quiet terror, because everyone there understood that if the case succeeded, not only would Temperance lose the mill, but the very existence of the hidden settlement. 6 people with nowhere else to go, one of them nearly 72 years old, would be exposed to a county court and a banker with every reason to want them gone from land he coveted. Willa, sharp-tongued with fear, argued that they should simply vanish back into secrecy, abandon the mill before the case was ever heard, scatter into the hills the way her grandfather's people had scattered once before. Ezra himself grew quiet and gray, an old man watching the second home he had ever known threatened by the same kind of power that had burned the first one to the ground. But Temperance, sitting up late by lamplight with her father's ledger and her father's compass on the table before her, found herself returning again and again to his old words, a map is a promise, and a surveyor's whole duty is to make sure the promise is kept, and she began, methodically, patiently, the way he had taught her to work a difficult survey line, to build her case. She rode to the county archive in Coldwater Crossing and spent 3 days poring over records no one had examined in decades, and there, in a box of old surveyor's correspondence that the clerk had nearly refused to let her see, she found what she needed, letters, faded but legible, between Josiah Vance and the Territorial Land Office, carefully documenting, in the dry, bureaucratic language that no court could dismiss as sentiment, his original survey of Millrace Hollow, his notation of an existing structure and occupied improvement upon it, and, most crucially, a formal notice of assessment dated a full 2 years before the parcel first appeared on any published county map, proving beyond any reasonable challenge that the tax basis Vane sought to overturn had been established by a licensed territorial surveyor acting within his lawful authority, whatever private kindness might also have moved his hand. She found, too, old receipts and barter records that Ezra had kept himself, in his careful, deliberate script, across 20 years, proof, however humble, of continuous occupation and improvement of the land, which under territorial law counted for a very great deal indeed. And she understood, laying it all out across the mill's flour-dusted worktable with Ezra and Willa looking on in astonishment, that the very secrecy the settlement had guarded so fiercely for 2 decades could now, properly assembled and properly presented, become not their vulnerability but their strongest shield, because the law, whatever its failures, still respected a paper trail, and Josiah Vance, debt-bound and careful, had left them one. The hearing was held in the Coldwater Crossing courthouse on a gray November morning, and half the town turned out, drawn by curiosity as much as anything, to see the widow who'd bought a joke of a land parcel try to hold it against the county's most powerful banker. Vane's lawyer argued smoothly that the assessment was irregular, that no legitimate mill had ever appeared in any tax survey prior to the widow's purchase, that the whole affair smelled of fraud dressed up as folklore. Temperance rose when her turn came, and she did not argue with passion or with tears, because she had learned from her father that a survey does not win an argument by shouting but by being unassailably, patiently correct, and she laid before the judge, item by item, the documentary chain that Josiah Vance had built 30 years before and that she had spent 3 days painstakingly reassembling, the original survey correspondence, the assessment notice predating the maps, the 20 years of barter receipts proving continuous occupation, and, when the judge pressed her on the nature of that occupation, she told the truth plainly and without apology, that a mill had stood in that hollow for 2 decades, tended by freed people who had asked nothing of the county but to be left in peace, and that the land's quiet, undisturbed tax history was not evidence of fraud but evidence of exactly the kind of settled, improved, lawfully occupied land that the tax code was designed to recognize. There was a long silence in that courtroom, and Temperance felt the whole weight of the Hollow's 20 hidden years resting on it, but the judge, an old circuit rider named Hollis Pruitt who had seen a good deal of the territory's rough justice over the years and had, it turned out, little patience for bankers using courtrooms to seize by legal maneuver what they could not acquire by fair offer, found for the defendant, and Cornelius Vane's challenge was dismissed with a curtness that made him rise from his chair and leave the courthouse without a word to anyone. It was not, in the end, a dramatic reckoning, no fistfight, no public humiliation, nothing so theatrical as the stories sometimes make it. Vane's punishment was quieter and, in its way, more fitting. Word of the hearing spread through the county within days, and with it word of what he had tried to do to a widow and a company of elderly freed people who had harmed no one, and the men whose trust and deposits had built his standing in Coldwater Crossing began, slowly but unmistakably, to withdraw both. Within 2 years his bank would fail entirely and he would leave the territory in quiet disgrace, while the railroad spur, when it finally came, ran its supply contracts not through him but through the newly and properly registered Co. and Rourke Milling Company, which Temperance and Ezra formed together that same winter, bringing the Hollow, at last, and entirely on their own terms, into the daylight of the public record. And here is the heart of what Temperance did next, the thing that made her story worth telling at all. She did not use her sudden, hard-won security to simply enrich herself, though heaven knows she had earned the right to. She used the mill's newly legitimate standing, and the fair contracts that followed, to rebuild what the whole surrounding country had been quietly losing for years, because Coldwater Crossing, like so much of that territory, had suffered 2 poor harvests running and a local grain elevator that gouged desperate farmers on price, and Temperance, remembering too well what it was to be desperate and dismissed, set the mill's rates lower than any competitors, extended credit through the winter to families who could not pay until spring, and hired on, as the operation grew, not only Willa and the other Hollow residents but half a dozen struggling homesteaders from the surrounding hills who badly needed honest wages. The mill that every map had called alive for 30 years became, within 3 years, the beating economic heart of the whole valley, and the Hollow itself, no longer hidden but no longer hunted either, became simply a place where people lived and worked, its history known and honored rather than concealed. So we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a 24-year-old woman standing at the edge of a road with almost nothing, cast out by a grieving man's misplaced anger, carrying $11.40 and her father's compass and, though she did not yet know it, the whole of his patient, careful wisdom besides. Every map in that county had marked a mill that the world insisted was never built, and the world had been wrong for 30 years, not because the mill did not exist, but because the people who kept it running had needed, for their own survival, to be believed invisible. What Temperance Rourke did was not simply find a hidden mill and claim its riches. She found a truth the world had chosen not to see, and rather than exploit that blindness for her own gain, she spent her hard-won position bringing the truth fully, safely, permanently into the light, and in doing so, she restored not only a mill but a whole forgotten community, and proved, as her father had always told her a good map must, that the promise written long ago could still, decades later, be honestly kept. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Temperance Rourke. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that worth is not always where the world expects to find it, and that the things others discard as foolish sometimes carry the weight of someone else's careful, hidden hope. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. What is a time you found real value in something the world had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and we love hearing which parts of these stories stay with you longest. Until next time, stay close.